The courtroom was already tense, but no one expected what came next. In a chamber where silence usually commanded respect, the sound that broke it was sharp, cutting, and unmistakable. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, with her gavel hovering like a weapon, turned her gaze toward Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and delivered a command designed to stop her cold. "That's enough. Sit down." The words echoed through the walls like a slap across the face of democracy itself. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Reporters lowered their pens. Cameras clicked into stillness, and the entire room leaned in. Crockett stood tall, her eyes locked on the judge, her voice still lingering in the air from the point she had been making, a point so sharp, so daring, that it had clearly struck a nerve. The authority of the highest bench was attempting to smother the voice of a woman who had clawed her way into the halls of power, not by privilege, but by persistence. You could feel in the crowd the collision of two worlds. On one side, the robed figure of authority, cloaked in centuries of institutional power, certain that a single command would silence dissent. On the other, a daughter of resilience, carrying the voices of those who have been ignored for far too long. This wasn't just about parliamentary procedure or courtroom order. It was about identity, dignity, and the right to stand unshaken when the world tells you to sit down. The silence stretched, thick as smoke. Would Jasmine bow to authority? Would she quietly step back, as so many before her had been forced to do? Or would she do what she has always done, look power in the eye and refuse to flinch? Every person in that room, every viewer glued to the broadcast, felt the question hanging in the air like a live wire. And then, with the faintest smile flickering at the corner of her lips, Jasmine drew a breath. It wasn't just a breath for herself. It was for the generations behind her who had been silenced, dismissed, and told to know their place. She was about to speak, and everyone in that courtroom knew, instinctively, that her next words would change everything. But what came out of her mouth would leave even the judge reeling, and the country stunned into silence. What made this clash more than just a courtroom exchange was the weight it carried far beyond the marble walls. It wasn't merely Sonia Sotomayor telling Jasmine Crockett to sit down. It was a symbol of how authority has long tried to muzzle voices that rise from the margins. Every immigrant who has been told they don't belong, every worker who has been silenced in boardrooms, every citizen who has been dismissed when they dare to speak truth to power. This moment belonged to them. Crockett wasn't just debating law. She was embodying resistance. Her words before the interruption had struck at the core of hypocrisy, daring to expose cracks in the very foundation of authority. And Sotomayor's sharp command, whether intentional or not, revealed just how uncomfortable the truth can make those who sit high on the bench. The stakes weren't procedural. They were existential. Was America truly a place where truth could be spoken without fear? Or would even its most respected institutions tremble at voices that challenged their comfort? The crowd inside the chamber could feel it. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, hungry for what might come next. Viewers watching at home sensed it too, that rare electric moment when history teeters on the edge of transformation. If Crockett backed down, it would affirm what cynics had always believed, that even the boldest voices are eventually swallowed by power. But if she stood firm, if she found the courage to answer back, it could ignite something far larger than that room. And Jasmine Crockett was not the type to fold. She knew that the weight of silence is heavier than the sting of confrontation. She knew that moments like these aren't handed out twice. They arrive like lightning, and if you're ready, you catch them. Her preparation, her resilience, her unshakable sense of identity. Everything had brought her to this single crossroad. The judge's words still hung in the air like chains waiting to be locked. But Crockett's reply, though not yet spoken, already pulsed like thunder on the horizon. Everyone could feel it. The question wasn't if she would respond. It was how. And when she finally did, it wouldn't just rattle a courtroom. It would rattle the nation. To understand the gravity of this clash, you have to know who Sonia Sotomayor is in the American imagination. She has long stood as a figure draped in both respect and fear, one of the 9 guardians of constitutional authority. Her words carry the weight of centuries. Her rulings ripple through lives across the nation. To face her in open defiance is not just a challenge a person. It is a challenge an institution. That is what made her sudden attempt to silence Jasmine Crockett so explosive. Sotomayor rose to prominence as a symbol of achievement, a daughter of Puerto Rican immigrants who climbed the ladder of education and power to reach the highest court in the land. For many, she was proof that the American dream was still alive, that a child from the Bronx could one day reshape the law. But in recent years, whispers of contradiction have followed her robes. Critics argue she has too often leaned into the comfort of authority, forgetting to fire the struggle that once defined her. Admirers turned skeptics watch with unease, asking whether she has become more a protector of the system than a challenger of its flaws. And in that chamber, those whispers became visible. Her command to silence Crockett carried not only the authority of justice, but also the arrogance of someone certain that their voice should drown out all others. It was the echo of centuries-old patterns. Power speaking down to the marginalized, authority expecting deference simply because it wears a robe. This was not the first time Sotomayor's judgment had raised eyebrows. In moments where the nation demanded bold clarity, she sometimes offered cautious restraint. To her defenders, this was wisdom. To her critics, it was timidity disguised as balance. But Crockett's defiance brought those questions into the sharpest relief. Was Sotomayor protecting order or silencing dissent? Was she upholding dignity or undermining it? What made the clash so riveting was the mirror it held up to America itself. The judge, once a child of struggle, now appeared as the embodiment of establishment authority. Crockett, a rising voice forged in battles with injustice, stood as a challenger who would not yield. Authority versus authenticity. Past dreams versus present truths. The old guard trying to contain the new. And so, as the gavel hovered and the judge's words rang out, America saw not just a single command, but a deeper contradiction. The immigrant child who had risen to power was now attempting to silence another fighter carrying the torch forward. The irony was as sharp as it was undeniable. But authority has its limits, and arrogance often carries the seeds of downfall. In trying to silence Crockett, Sotomayor had set in motion the very storm she hoped to avoid. Before the gavel struck, before the nation held its breath, Jasmine Crockett had already lived a story that prepared her for this moment. She was not born into privilege, not handed an easy path. Her rise was carved from grit, persistence, and a stubborn refusal to accept that dignity should ever be negotiable. Jasmine's roots trace back to the very struggles that so many Americans know intimately. Working-class families juggling bills, mothers and fathers sacrificing sleep just to keep food on the table, neighborhoods where opportunity wasn't handed out but hunted for. In those early years, she learned two truths that would define her future. Injustice is real, and silence only helps the oppressor. Law school became her weapon. What others saw as lectures and textbooks, Jasmine saw as the keys to survival for those who had no voice in the system stacked against them. She didn't just study the law. She studied the gaps, the cracks where ordinary people were swallowed by bureaucracy and bias. And rather than chase the safe path to corporate law, she dove headfirst into defending those the system routinely forgot: poor defendants, marginalized communities, voices buried under the weight of authority. Her courtroom style was unlike anything the establishment expected. She wasn't polished into submission. She was fire with precision, delivering arguments with a cadence of lived experience. To some, she was too much, too loud, too direct, too unwilling to bend. But to those who needed her, she was exactly enough. In every sharp line of questioning, every refusal to back down, she became proof that representation is not just symbolic, it's survival. When Jasmine entered politics, the establishment scoffed. They saw a young black woman from Texas, outspoken and unafraid, and assumed she would be easy to dismiss. Instead, she flipped the script. Her campaigns were fueled not by corporate donors, but by grassroots fire. She spoke the language of the people, the frustration, the pride, the hope. She turned every dismissal into fuel, every insult into a louder microphone. By the time she entered the halls of power, she carried with her not just her own voice, but the voices of those long silenced. That is what made her presence in that courtroom electric. She wasn't just Jasmine Crockett. She was every mother denied justice, every worker silenced by bosses, every immigrant told to stay quiet. She was the embodiment of defiance wrapped in dignity. And so, when Judge Sotomayor tried to cut her down, Jasmine's response wasn't just personal, it was generational. It was a clash of the establishment's old comfort with a new kind of courage. She had been underestimated all her life, and every scar had taught her the same lesson. When they try to silence you, that is a moment to speak louder than ever before. The courtroom had no idea that what was about to come would not only shake its walls, but echo across a nation. The tension in the courtroom was no longer subtle. It was a storm gathering strength, electrifying every exchange. Judge Sonia Sotomayor's attempt to rein Jasmine in had been sharp, designed to reassert control and remind everyone who sat at the top of the hierarchy. But Jasmine wasn't rattled. If anything, the interruption only sharpened her focus. The air grew heavy as Sotomayor leaned forward, her tone clipped, authoritative. "Counselor, you're straying from the point." Her words carried weight, the kind that could silence lesser voices with ease. And for a heartbeat, the silence in the chamber suggested she had succeeded. But then Jasmine's eyes lifted, steady, unflinching, almost daring. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she began to build her argument with deliberate calm, her words carrying the quiet intensity of someone who had already lived through worse storms than this. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, "the point is exactly what they want to bury, and I refuse to let that happen." A ripple spread across the courtroom, attorneys shifting in their seats, reporters scribbling furiously, spectators leaning in closer. Sotomayor's face tightened, a flash of irritation breaking through her judicial mask. She countered quickly, pushing again to cut off Jasmine's momentum. But every attempt only exposed a contrast. Sotomayor's authority felt brittle, while Jasmine's defiance carried the weight of authenticity. Each word Jasmine spoke dug deeper, not only into the case at hand, but into the moral undercurrents running beneath it. She reminded the room of the people who would suffer if silence prevailed, the communities erased by technicalities, the truths abandoned when comfort mattered more than justice. Her voice, measured yet piercing, filled every corner of the courtroom. The escalation was no longer just legal. It was emotional, cultural, symbolic. Jasmine wasn't simply debating. She was embodying a struggle far larger than herself. Sotomayor's repeated interjections, once powerful, now sounded like desperation against an unstoppable tide. The crowd could feel it, the shift, the imbalance of power tipping before their very eyes. And just as Sotomayor prepared her sharpest interruption yet, Jasmine paused, letting the silence hang like a held breath. What came next would not just answer the judge's challenge. It would define the confrontation itself. The silence before Jasmine spoke again was almost unbearable. Every eye in the courtroom fixed on her, waiting to see whether she would retreat under the pressure or rise to meet it. Her voice, when it returned, was calm, too calm. It was the kind of calm that signals the storm has arrived. "Your Honor," Jasmine began, her gaze steady, "I am not here to make anyone comfortable. I am here because people who don't look like me, who don't come from where I come from, expect the system to work for them, and too often it does. But when it comes to people like us, suddenly the rules bend, the patience wears thin, and the doors begin to close. If that's not the point, then I have to ask, what is?" The words hit the chamber with the force of a hammer. Some gasped, others whispered, but Jasmine pressed on, each line landing heavier than the last. She didn't shout. She didn't need theatrics. Her power came from precision, from her ability to say out loud what everyone else only dared to hint at. Sotomayor tried to interject again, raising her hand like a shield. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned in, her voice slicing through the interruption. "With respect, Your Honor, silencing me doesn't erase the truth. It doesn't undo the harm. And it certainly doesn't make this system any more just. What it does is prove my point that when someone like me speaks too loudly, the first instinct is not to listen, but to shut it down." The courtroom froze. It was no longer just a clash of authority and defiance. It was exposure. Jasmine had dragged into the light the very dynamics that many pretended didn't exist. For a moment, Sotomayor's authority seemed smaller, not because her position had changed, but because Jasmine had forced the nation to see what was hidden beneath it. Reporters scribbled faster, their pens barely keeping up. Spectators sat forward, caught between awe and disbelief. Even those who had doubted Jasmine's presence in the courtroom could no longer deny the courage unfolding before them. And then, with a final strike, Jasmine delivered the blow that left the chamber reeling. Justice is not silence. Justice is not convenience. Justice is standing in the fire and refusing to move until every person, every single one, can stand here without fear of being silenced. The words linger like thunder after lightning. The room, once restless with interruptions, was now suspended in stunned quiet. Sotomayor's face remained impassive, but the silence told the story. Jasmine had seized the moment, and what happened next would take the shockwaves beyond the courtroom, spilling into homes, feeds, and conversations across the country. The courtroom may have quieted, but outside those walls, Jasmine's words detonated like a political earthquake. Within hours, clips of her counterattack flooded social media. On TikTok, hashtags like hashtag Crockett Unstoppable and hashtag Justice Speaks trended at lightning speed. Twitter erupted with side-by-side memes. Jasmine standing tall against a gavel, Sotomayor caught in a freeze frame of frustration. Celebrities chimed in, praising her courage. Activists declared her speech a blueprint for resistance. Even late-night hosts replayed the moment, framing it as proof that truth can still cut through power. Across living rooms and classrooms, Americans who often felt ignored saw themselves in Jasmine's defiance. She had turned a courtroom exchange into a rallying cry. But the real shockwaves weren't digital. They were cultural. Students debated it in universities. Workers brought it up in lunchrooms. Families whispered about it at dinner tables. What Jasmine had done transcended law. She had reframed silence itself as a battlefield, and once that idea was released into the air, it was impossible to contain. Still, with all the celebration came one question that grew louder each passing hour. If she could stand up like that in the courtroom, what would she do next? In the end, Jasmine Crockett's moment wasn't just about a clash with Sonia Sotomayor. It was about a truth larger than either of them. Dignity cannot be silenced. Her words echoed the struggles of immigrants, workers, and everyday Americans who knew too well what it felt like to be spoken over, dismissed, erased. Her response reminded the nation that justice is not handed down. It is demanded, fought for, and spoken into existence. She didn't argue for herself alone. She argued for every silenced voice in the history of this country. Her calm defiance embodied a universal lesson. When arrogance meets authenticity, arrogance crumbles. And as the courtroom slowly returned to order, the moral crescendo lingered. Jasmine had shown that courage doesn't require volume. It requires conviction. She had reframed what power looks like, proving that the truest authority comes not from titles or benches, but from truth delivered with fearless clarity. Her reply was more than a mic drop. It was a torch passed on to anyone listening. Speak, even when they try to silence you. Especially then. This was more than just a courtroom clash. It was a moment that revealed the fault lines of power and the unstoppable force of truth. Jasmine Crockett's words will be studied, shared, and remembered, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she stood her ground when it mattered most. And now, the question turns to you. What will you do with this story? Will you share it, discuss it, let it ignite conversations in your home, your school, your workplace? Because stories like these are not just headlines. They are calls to action. If you believe in justice over silence, in dignity over arrogance, then don't let this moment fade into memory. Keep it alive. Share it. Be part of the movement that refuses to be silenced. This is Argument Arena, where truth takes the mic and dignity always wins. Subscribe, stay with us, and let's make sure voices like Jasmine Crockett's are never silenced again.